Chapter 27. A Ghost Returns. How do I even describe today? There was so much joy, such indescribable joy. Shock, too, for both of us. I had given up hope, and so had he. Standing there face to face was like a page out of one of my dreams. How often had those dreams haunted my night? I hated waking up and realizing I had only dreamed it. I think tomorrow I will pinch myself and check here in this journal before I believe that it is really real. Jess's journal. Chris and Carrie walked down to the end of Main Street and turned right, heading first north and then crossing over Highway 58. It wasn't much of a highway, just a 2-lane road running from east to west. Do you think Wes and, what was her name, Sarah, will be all right? Carrie asked. The look on the older man's face was one that neither of them had ever seen. It might have been 20 years or more, but the woman had run off with his kids, and no matter what had prompted her to do it, would Wes be able to forgive her for it? Yeah, Chris said, and he squinted in the bright sunlight. It was a hot day. I think they'll be okay. He stared at the remains of what had been the new price chopper, which had opened just a handful of years before the collapse. The walls had collapsed in, the insides blackened with fire. He wondered when it happened. It had been cleaned out early on, after the trucks stopped showing up with food and goods. One of the first signs of the collapse had been the breakdown in the chain of deliveries. Slowly, stores found themselves out of one item, then another, until finally a cascade of outages, combined with ever-increasing blackouts and a panicked rush on the foodstuffs that remained, had caused the store to close. Chris could still see a portion of one of the handwritten signs that had been placed in the glass windows. It should have read, "Store closed until further notice," but all that remained was "Store clo," and the rest of the sign was long gone, as was the glass window it had hung on inside. Now they were passing the road to nowhere, an access road that had been planned, along with several miles of walking trails and never finished, yet another victim of the financial troubles years before the actual collapse. The pavement was now cracked and warped. Several trees had pushed through the tarmac and were flourishing, undeterred by their asphalt surroundings. The road was clear and there was little traffic, either on foot or by auto. It was obvious that the town's population had been severely decimated. Prior to the collapse, there had been more than 20,000 residents in Belton. From the looks of it, there was perhaps 10% of that number now. The day before, they had made their way slowly through parts of Kansas City. The highways were in tatters. All overpasses had long been destroyed, and huge swaths of the city appeared to be nothing but blackened ruins. Wes had spoken with a few others shortly outside of St. Louis, and learned that Kansas City had endured several large fires over the course of a decade of hot and dry summers. It had destroyed most of the inner city, sparing only a few homes in the historic Northeast District, and leaving the West Bottoms full of blackened and crumbling brick buildings. Most of downtown had been lost, as well as nearly all of the poorer neighborhoods, where the old houses were filled with dry, brittle wood, just waiting for an excuse to go up in flames. The city had suffered greatly in the aftermath of the collapse. The loss of many of its inhabitants from the inner core had occurred years before the collapse, but it was hit hard when the country descended into anarchy and war. In wide swaths throughout the state, homes were left abandoned, crime rose, and those who could fled to the suburbs and surrounding countryside. This had all occurred years before the collapse, but it had set the tone for what came next. Despite the efforts of many to repopulate the city at the turn of the century, and try to save some of the historic yet crumbling buildings. When the collapse finally came, it hit hard and fast. The loss of utilities, clean water, dependable electricity, and finally gas main breaks was only the beginning of Kansas City's woes. Quickly, food shortages and waterborne illnesses due to the lack of utilities began to take a horrific toll on the inhabitants who were left. The hospitals collapsed next, due to the shortage in supplies and loss of infrastructure. It was a scene that played out in city after city, one that resulted in mayhem, death, and the panicked flight of the remaining population. Kansas City had become a ghost town, filled with collapsed buildings and a general sense of empty decay. There were a few pockets of civilization, certain areas that had held out and refused to fall into ruin. Here and there, scattered through the city, people bustled about, tending large gardens and empty lots, repairing what they could of the damaged buildings closest to them, and working toward opening trade routes. Belton was a world of difference from the chaos and destruction they had seen when passing through the city. Chris had winced as he pointed out much of the cultural center of Kansas City, which was now abandoned, looted and destroyed. Even the grand stone edifice of the Nelson Atkins Art Museum had reflected the devastation of the collapse and the warring troops that had fought for control of the ruins of the former United States. It had been heavily damaged during mortar fire, and most of the roof in the older section had collapsed. The highway overpass that bisected the town of Belton into its east and west sides had been obliterated. The on- and off-ramps still remained, but they were closed into narrow sections, of which a normal car barely fit through, intentionally. Military vehicles, large trucks, especially a tank or Humvee, would not be able to pass through the choked-off passage 10 feet high on each side of twisted rock and metal rebar. The van and truck waited for them near Main Street, but it felt good to stretch their legs, and gas was too difficult to find to waste on a little side trip. As they walked, slowly approaching a large network of fences and walls, with the obvious smell of cattle emanating from them, Chris was experiencing what could only be described as double vision. The memory of what had been a United Rentals and Casey's gas station next to it was clear in his memory. How often had he taken a run with his dad to rent an auger or chipper? How often had he and Jess begged for a treat when stopping at the Casey's for gas? It was, however, overlaid by what now existed. Blackened ruins with amorphous lumps within. His memories of his hometown were sharp. It felt as if the past 12 years had passed in a quick snap of fingers, and Chris felt as if he was waking from a dream. He wondered why he had never come back, never tried, never once to find out what had become of the home and the family he had lost. In the distance, coming toward them, was a man on a horse. He wore a bandana, most likely to soak up the sweat from the heat of the sun pounding down on him. Chris stared at him, thinking he looked vaguely familiar, and the man stared back, a look of shock on his face. "Chris Aronson?" the man asked, a tone of wonder in his voice. His hair was red, and Chris couldn't place him, but he appeared close to the same age, late 20s, early 30s at the most. He certainly knew Chris, which made Chris uneasy and embarrassed he couldn't place him. "Yeah, I'm Chris, and I'm sorry, it's been a long journey. You are..." He stared at the man as he dismounted. "Todd Stevens. I was a couple years ahead of you in school and at Scouts." The man grinned and shook his head. "I just can't believe it's you. Where in the hell have you been, Aronson?" Chris's memories of a red-headed, lanky teen a couple of years older than him came flooding back. They had bunked in the same tent one year when the Scouts went on their annual campout. Todd had been a cool guy, and he hadn't been a jerk to Chris and Alan. He'd shared his homemade beef jerky and showed them some tips during archery lessons. "Man, Todd," I remember you now." He reached out and shook Todd's hand and turned to Carrie, who had been quietly watching the exchange. "This is my wife, Carrie. I've been in Tennessee for nearly 12 years now, in a small town by the name of Tiptonville. We're moving on, going on to Denver, but I had to stop and see the town before I went. See if the house is still standing." He shrugged. "Pay my respects to anyone from before, you know." Todd had a strange look on his face. "Well, your house is still there, Chris. Still there." He looked as if he wanted to say more, but thought better of it. "Let me walk you over there." He waved at one of the other sentries, which Chris had noticed were posted every few hundred yards, watchful, with horses saddled and ready to go nearby. "Most won't remember you, and we don't allow visitors through the gate without an escort." He shrugged. "The Reformation may be in full swing on the coasts, but I guess we've got a ways to go before it stops being the Wild West round here." He nodded to Carrie. "Nice to meet you, Carrie." They walked for another block, passing a sentry along the way. It appeared that everyone was heavily armed and quite watchful. "Have trouble with raiders?" Chris asked. "Yeah, now and then. It just makes sense to be more watchful. Word gets back to 'em, and they stop trying. Leastways, the attacks have petered off to nothing, down from a swarm of them last year. We lost 2 men and 20 head of cattle, including 2 beautiful heifers we were hoping to breed." They passed through a set of heavy metal cattle doors. Half of the block had been burned, but the houses here had been torn down, hauled away, and the empty lots filled with gardens. Every possible space was being utilized. They were quickly approaching Chris's old street. As the small group turned onto the street, Chris's pulse quickened. He could see his childhood home, just barely. It was hiding now behind tall trees and massive blackberry bushes. Most of the houses were gone on this street, but there were fruiting bushes, fruit trees, and rows of in-ground plants in various stages of growth. From the looks of it, the land was intensively planted, every bit of it utilized to grow something. It was a riot of green growth. Chris stopped in the middle of the road as a boy, aged 11 or 12, popped out of a long line of corn, chasing a dark-haired girl, pelting her with what looked like overripe, grape-sized tomatoes as she screamed and laughed. One hit her square in the back as she skidded to a stop in front of the group. The boy, also dark-haired, was so intent on chasing her that he nearly ran into the back of her, crashing to the ground to avoid knocking her over. Both kids stared at Chris and Carrie curiously. Todd Stevens laughed. "You kids are sure working hard, I see." He reached a hand down, helping the boy up. Chris thought the boy looked eerily familiar, but he couldn't possibly know this boy. He would have been an infant at most, on the day Belton was invaded. Todd asked, "Where's your mom? Tell her I've got someone she would like to meet." Chris stared as the boy, who looked so strangely familiar, as did the girl, they were obviously siblings, gave Chris a short, appraising stare with his crayon blue eyes and ran off, calling to his mother. "Mom, hey Mom, we've got visitors." He disappeared around a row of trees, and several hens squawked in alarm at his passing. "Someone's living here, then," he said. A statement and a question rolled into one. Todd nodded, a peculiar smile forming on his face, as if there was a joke that Chris should be clued in on. Chris's heart panged a little at the thought. The memories, some of the best memories of his life, were of that house. It felt both good and painful to think that someone was living here. The house looked relatively well cared for, and the garden would have made his mother proud. How she had loved her garden and teaching her neighbors how to grow luscious fruits and vegetables out of soil once reserved for immaculate lawns and ornamental flowers. A young man with unruly dark brown hair and patched jeans came around the corner with a wheelbarrow. He was in his early 20s, and his arms and chest were tanned dark from the sun. "Hey, Todd, what do you know?" he asked with a friendly smile on his face, a look of curiosity at the strange man and woman in front of him. "Hey, David, I have some folks here you'll want to meet," Todd said, nodding to Chris and Carrie. "This here is Carrie, and this is Chris Aronson." David's face changed from a look of welcome to one of shock. He had been in the act of shaking hands with Carrie and froze at the mention of Chris's last name. "Aronson?" He glanced at Todd. "Does she know?" Chris wondered who she was. He began to page through his memories. Had there been a girl or woman here who knew him? For a brief moment his hope surged at the thought that possibly his mother was still alive. As quickly as the hope came, it died. Alan had been sure. Chris had wrested the memories from his friend, insisting he know every detail. They had both died, his mom and his dad, and the children who had fallen behind and slowed them down had died with them. Alan had been certain, and God knows Chris had tried to convince himself that it wasn't true, but reality was harshly indifferent to hope. And Jess, those scumbags had told them all about how she had died, her and Aaron. The dull ache of her memory thumped in his chest. Losing Jess, knowing she was gone and he had failed to protect her, that was the worst part of it, and it is what had set his feet walking far, far away from the only home he had ever known. There was a woman approaching now. Lean, slender build, golden hair tumbling in curls over her shoulders and down her back. She was preceded by the dark-haired boy, and followed by a girl with red hair who was perhaps 6, maybe older. The young woman drew near, and Chris's heart stuttered to a stop. She was equally as shocked, stopping in mid-stride with a gasp, her mouth a perfectly round O of disbelief. "Oh my God. Chris?" Chris blinked in shock, and finally found his voice. "Jess?"